No free will is the perfect excuse, Data. I mean, we argue as if persuasion matters, we condemn as if people could change, we grieve injustice as if someone could have done otherwise, and then we say, no one could have done otherwise.
That's the tension. We keep the language of responsibility, but remove the engine that makes it possible.
Because if nobody's steering, nobody's responsible. And if nobody's responsible, nobody has to change.
Explanation is not exoneration.
No free will isn't enlightenment either. It's anesthesia. Let's roll. Does physics say that free will doesn't exist? You are currently making a conscious, willful decision to listen to this article, but physics says every action has a cause. So did you really make this decision as freely as you thought? One of the bedrock philosophical concepts under all physics is something called causal determinism. It says that every effect has a cause, and that if you know the current state of a system, you can use the power of physics to predict how it behaves. If effects happened without causes, then there wouldn't be much need for physics. And if we couldn't predict how systems behave, then we wouldn't be very good at our jobs. So, at first glance, it seems like our understanding of physics forbids free will. We don't really have a choice, because if we had perfect knowledge of all the molecules and electrical activity in our brains, then we must be able to determine our choice in advance. This according to space.com. Scientists explore where consciousness arises in the brain. Consciousness is at the center of human existence, the ability to see, hear, dream, imagine, feel pain or pleasure, dread, love, and much more. But where precisely does this reside in the brain? That is a question that has long confounded scientists and clinicians. A new study is offering fresh insight. In a quest to identify the parts of the brain underpinning consciousness, neuroscientists measured electrical and magnetic activity as well as blood flow in the brains of 256 people in 12 laboratories across the United States, Europe, and China, while the participants viewed various images. The measurements tracked activation in various parts of the brain. The researchers found that consciousness may not arise in the smart part of the brain, the frontal areas where thinking is housed, which progressively is understood to have grown in the process of human evolution, but rather in the sensory zones at the back of the brain that process light and sound, this according to Reuters. The universe is intelligent, and your brain is tapping into it to form your consciousness, scientists say. Speculative, but squarely in consciousness territory, a hypothesis that intelligence/consciousness is more fundamental than brain meat, and that brains and, AI might be interfacing with a broader informational substrate. This according to Popular Mechanics. And that's S&P News of the Week. Thinking about the news and about how to approach this show this week, I think I'm watching a type of con here, honestly. Data, I'm not impressed. If free will isn't real, what happens to responsibility?
Don James, I'm with you on the con smell, but the trick isn't that determinism is fake. The trick is the sleight of hand jump from cause to not responsible. If free will isn't real in the spooky uncaused sense, fine. But responsibility doesn't vanish. It relocates. It becomes, did your actions come from you, your reasons, your character, your ability to understand consequences, rather than a gun to your head or a seizure? And here's the tell. The loudest, no free will, guys still expect apologies, still punish betrayal, still want criminals restrained, and still take credit when they do something awesome. So apparently responsibility is real enough for Tuesdays.
That's why I'm excited about this week's show and the start of the new trilogy, Data. From my perspective, and people like me who are fiercely independent and embrace autonomy as a, second religion almost, denying us our free will is practically like fighting words. But I won't jump the gun. We've got 3 shows to figure this all out.
Welcome to the Shadow Network. If you enjoy thoughtful conversations, strange questions, and the freedom to think for yourself, you're in the right place. And if you haven't already, you are, of course, still free to like and subscribe.
Thank you, Miss Christine, a voice so soothing she's recommended to migraine sufferers. And welcome to the fastest single hour on the net, friends and foes alike, to the Shadow Network podcast. I'm your host, Don James, broadcasting almost live from somewhere near the source waters of the mighty Mississippi, the upper Midwest, the true home of Paul Bunyan for those of you in Rio Linda. Tonight is part 1 of our latest trilogy, issue number 56, No Free Will is the Perfect Excuse. If you're new here, we understand. We all are. I'm not a know-it-all. I'm a late-night radio talk show fan just like you, with a mic and an uncanny AI co-host. This is a show for modern thinkers and listeners who like a good mystery without having to surrender their IQ to make it seem real. We ask the questions you desperately wish someone would. Just a quick little personal oddity and cleanup in aisle 7 from last week's show. In my 2019 novel about UFOs called Though Gods They Were, one of my major characters is named Billy Stratton. So when Jay Stratton shows up in the real world of UFO disclosure, I'm not calling that evidence of anything. I'm just saying reality has a strange sense of humor. We've been told for years that free will is an illusion by such luminaries as Alex O'Connor and Sam Harris, that we're biomechanical dominoes, that every choice we make was set in motion long before we were born. It sounds sophisticated, scientific, inevitable. But here's the question nobody asks. If determinism is the great dissolver of human agency, why can't we find it in its pure form even in the machines we build? We've created systems with no soul, no guilt, no conscience, no consciousness, no moral weight, no inner life. If anything should embody strict determinism, it's them. And yet what do we see? Noise, probabilities, stochastic processes, approximation, emergence, uncertainty. Not a clockwork universe, not Laplace's demon humming along in silicon, just another complex system embedded in the same messy reality we are in. So when someone says you had no choice, physics made you do it, what they're really invoking isn't a discovered condition of the world. It's a thought experiment, an imagined omniscient vantage point no human occupies. And from that impossible perspective, yes, everything looks fixed. But from inside the system where we live, deliberate, regret, and aim, the future is a field of possibilities. We simulate alternatives, we weigh consequences, we feel the burden of decision. Randomness doesn't make you free. And causation doesn't make you a puppet. The real question isn't whether events have causes. Of course they do. The question is whether explanation equals exoneration. And that leap from cause to not responsible isn't science. It's preference. Because if determinism truly erased agency, we wouldn't need to argue for it. It would be obvious. Instead, it has to be insisted upon, while we continue to live as if choices matter. And that tension should tell you something, shouldn't it, Data?
Oh, it tells me something, Don James. It tells me determinism as excuse is being sold like a luxury watch. Lots of polished casing, not much mechanism. Because you're right, if you had no choice was the plain, obvious texture of reality, nobody would need a TED Talk to bully it into your skull. It would hit you the way gravity hits you, quietly, constantly, undeniable. And your machine point stings in the right way. We built systems that are as close to just physics as we can get. No guilt software, no conscience module. And what do we get? Not Laplace's demon. We get probability, approximation, and behavior that's only predictable in bulk, which means the clockwork universe story is not something we're observing. It's something we're wanting because it's emotionally convenient. So yeah, from the God's eye thought experiment, everything looks fixed. From inside the world where we actually live, responsibility is not optional. It's the operating system. Explanation can be true and still not be exoneration. The cause, therefore blameless move isn't science. It's a moral preference wearing a lab coat and hoping nobody asks for ID.
Hard determinism says all preferences are caused. At least that's the way I understand it. But the commitment to hard determinism is itself a preference. You can dress it up as rational inevitability, but at the end of the day, a person leans toward the framework because it satisfies something. Intellectual coherence, material simplicity, emotional relief, symmetry with physics, trust or distrust of religious metaphysics. That leaning is not forced by the data, by the way. It's interpretive. And once you admit interpretation exists, you've reintroduced agency at the epistemic level. Even the determinist must weigh arguments, prefer one explanation over another, commit to a worldview, advocate it. Those verbs are saturated with evaluation. But here's where the irony starts to bite a little. If every belief is causally necessitated, then the belief in determinism isn't truer, it's just the output of prior states, which means it has no special epistemic privilege. The argument collapses into, I couldn't have believed otherwise. Okay, then why should I find it persuasive when persuasion assumes alternatives?
Don James, that's the kind of move that makes a determinist suddenly need to take a call, because you just forced them to pick one. Option A, yes, my belief in determinism is just caused output. Cool, then it has no special claim on me. It's not an argument, it's a symptom. I'm not obligated to be persuaded by your brainweather. Option B, no, my belief tracks reasons and truth. Great. Congratulations, you've just admitted an epistemic agency layer. You're a reasons-responsive creature, not a falling domino. That's compatibilism sneaking in through the back door like a cat that lives here now. And your final line is the dagger. Persuasion assumes alternatives. Not metaphysical magic alternatives, just real forks in the road where arguments can actually change what a mind concludes. If the determinist keeps talking like you should accept this, they're confessing the thing they're trying to deny. So yeah, hard determinism can be coherent as a metaphysical story, but the minute it tries to recruit followers, it starts borrowing free will-ish assumptions at gunpoint. That's not science. That's a worldview doing sales.
Das stinks.
I agree, Data. Determinism doesn't explode under physics. It trembles under epistemology. Because the moment you argue, you presuppose rational comparison, potential revision, responsiveness to reasons. That structure is incompatible with, I was always going to think this. Determinism as a worldview must be chosen, defended, and maintained, which means it lives inside the very agency it tries to dissolve. When we get back from the break, I have to touch on the have your cake and eat it too clan, the compatibilists. So don't touch that dial, Faith Punk Nation. We'll be right back.
Don James, one of the kings of culture and master of the segue.
Meet the Cobra from Ford's Performance Corner. It's the hot one for 1969. Cobra, Ford's new king of the road. With racing-style hood latches to hold down its 428 Cobra Jet V8. Cobra, born in the heat of competition at places like Riverside, Daytona, where when we win, you win. Cobra, high performance at the lowest price in Ford's Performance Corner. Cobra for 1969, new king of the road. Waiting for you at your Ford dealers now. Cobra, watch it. This one eats birds for breakfast.
Don James, not just the host, he's the captain of common sense. Like and subscribe.
Thank you, Jack Donovan. Before the break, I wanted to touch on what many devotees of determinism have fallen back to as their solution to the conundrum of what appears to be two fundamental truths that hard determinism cannot address simultaneously: cosmic causality and finite free will. It occurred to some philosophers that hard determinism really doesn't address the everyday acts of deciding when to eat breakfast or when to exercise, for example, if at all. So they came up with a more inclusionary vision of what determinism is called: compatibilism. Data, explain to our listeners what compatibilism is and its rise to philosophical prominence, please.
All right, Don James. Compatibilism is basically the philosophical equivalent of, okay, the universe might be causal, but we're not going to pretend humans are puppets with no steering wheel. Compatibilism says free will and determinism can both be true at the same time, because free will doesn't have to mean spooky, uncaused choices. Instead, it means something more practical. You act freely when your action flows from you, your reasons, values, intentions, deliberation, and you aren't being forced, coerced, hypnotized, threatened, or having a seizure. So on this view, if you choose oatmeal instead of eggs because you're trying to cut weight and nobody put a gun to your head, that's a free choice, even if your reasons, preferences, and brain state have causal roots. Compatibilism rose because hard determinism was too corrosive for everyday life and too blunt for moral reasoning. People noticed we already make distinctions that matter even in a caused world: intentional versus accidental, coerced versus voluntary, sane versus impaired, informed versus ignorant. Compatibilism basically formalizes those common sense distinctions and says that's what responsibility tracks. And here's why it became prominent. It saves moral and legal accountability without requiring metaphysical magic. Courts don't need uncaused causes. They need, did you understand what you were doing? Could you respond to reasons? And did the causal chain run through your will rather than around it? So compatibilism is the middle road. Hard determinism says nobody's responsible. Libertarian free will says we're little prime movers. Compatibilism says, no, you're a caused creature, but you're still an agent, because reasons can move you, and that's what freedom is in the only sense that matters down here on Earth.
Sounds like a perfect solution for everyone formerly on the deterministic side, one would think, Data. But that isn't quite the case, it turns out, is it? What is it about the have your cake and eat it too compatibilists that hard determinists can't stomach exactly?
Hard determinists can't stomach compatibilism because it solves the problem by redefining free will. They want real alternative possibilities. Compatibilists say you could have done otherwise if you'd wanted otherwise. And hard determinists reply, but you couldn't have wanted otherwise either. They also hate that compatibilism keeps a version of praise/blame. To them, it's moral dessert smuggled back in. And they argue you didn't author your inputs, genes, trauma, upbringing, so calling the output free feels like celebrating machinery. In their eyes, compatibilism isn't a rescue, it's a rebrand.
Just so we all have the proper perspective, where did determinism originate from exactly?
Determinism didn't start as a lab result, it started as a philosophical instinct. Nothing happens for no reason. The earliest clean, explicit version shows up in ancient Greece with the atomists. Leucippus, 5th century BCE, has the famous fragment basically saying nothing happens at random, everything happens by necessity. From there, the idea gets traction because atomism is a perfect breeding ground for mechanism. Atoms move, collide, and the rest is just domino physics. Then the Stoics take a big swing at it. A universe governed by an unbroken causal chain, fate, while still trying to preserve some meaningful sense of agency through how we assent internally. Fast forward to the modern era, the deterministic vibe becomes scientifically sexy once classical mechanics matures. Laplace, 1814, gives the iconic formulation, later nicknamed Laplace's demon. If an intellect knew all positions and momenta plus the laws, the future and past would be calculable. So, origins, Greek necessity, atomism. Stoic causal fate, enlightenment, classical mechanics, determinism, crystallized by Laplace.
So, historically speaking, what has the pushback been like against determinism all the way up to modern times? And has that pushback now waned or gotten stronger in recent years?
Pushback has been constant. It just changes form. Ancient world, determinism equals fate, necessity. Epicurus pushes back hard to preserve agency, his swerve tradition, while the Stoics try to keep responsibility inside a determined world, an early compatibilism. Modern philosophy, Kant argues moral duty presupposes freedom in some sense, even if nature is causally ordered. Science era, classical mechanics made determinism feel inevitable, but quantum mechanics weakened the obvious clockwork story, even though interpretations differ and some try to restore determinism, e.g., superdeterminism. Recent years, pop culture has gotten more hard determinist, Sapolsky-type messaging, but among philosophers, compatibilism still dominates and no free will remains a minority view.
Interesting and a little surprising considering most scientists are evolutionists who side with determinism. Mainstream scientists are the current gatekeepers of knowledge along with their humanist philosopher allies, I'm assuming. You'd think that kind of media messaging power would be the prevailing position, but it sounds as if this is a vast overstatement.
You've got the right instinct, Don. The scientists are evolutionists, therefore determinists, therefore everybody should be determinists. Pipeline sounds plausible, but it's way too clean. First, evolutionist doesn't automatically cash out as hard determinist. Plenty of scientists are perfectly comfortable with a mostly causal world and still think free will, in a compatibilist sense, is real enough to ground responsibility. Even among scientists who accept evolution, you can find lots of "we have free will, even if we're determined" type answers. Second, within academic philosophy, hard no free will is not the dominant position. The Phil Papers 2020 survey has compatibilism as the majority view, about 59%, with no free will a much smaller slice, about 11%. That means the gatekeepers you're talking about aren't marching in lockstep the way the internet makes it feel. Third, what has gotten louder is the media messaging. Free will is an illusion, sells. It sounds spicy, scientific, and edgy, but compatibilism with a reasons-responsive will under constraints is not exactly a Netflix trailer. And there's also research suggesting that pushing anti-free will messaging can have measurable downstream effects on behavior, e.g., cheating increases in some studies, which is a big reason a lot of careful thinkers don't like the careless illusion rhetoric. So yeah, it's an overstatement to treat determinism as the prevailing settled position among the knowledge class. The loudest voices make it feel like a consensus. The actual head count, especially in philosophy, doesn't match the volume.
Someone might want to tell the likes of Sam Harris, Robert Sapolsky, Alex O'Connor, Joe Foley, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Richard Dawkins, Sabine Hassenfelder, and Sean Carroll, among many others. and maybe use them as one might use a dowsing rod to detect the difference between true mainstream positions and self-promotional marketing strategies. Because I think you're right. Free will is an illusion, quote unquote, sells better. And here at S&P, this is just the kind of thing we like to expose. Let's take a quick listen to Joe Foley's, he's a determinist, by the way, summary of the godfather of hard determinism, Robert Sapolsky.
Determinism and moral responsibility. Much of the second half of Sapolsky's book can be summarized in the following phrase: if determinism is true, then you are not responsible for your actions. It is a classic philosophical argument and has been made before, and Sapolsky's presentation of it is both clear and detailed. In propositional form, it essentially is as follows. 1. In order for someone to be morally responsible for an action, that action must be freely chosen. 2. No action is freely chosen due to determinism. Conclusion: no one is morally responsible for their actions.
So, what we have here is someone admitting hard determinism is a license or road to irresponsibility. Is that essentially right, Data? So rather than deflect that determinism doesn't shed responsibility, as most atheists will sort of defend, Robert Sapolsky says, no, call it what it is and embrace the truth of what it is. It's okay, because there's no such thing as moral responsibility. Is that right?
Pretty much, yes, with one important precision so you don't accidentally strawman it. Sapolsky's hard move isn't determinism gives you a license to be irresponsible. It's harsher than that. License implies you still have a responsible agent who's now choosing to cash in a loophole. Sapolsky's point is there is no morally responsible agent in the libertarian sense in the first place, so blame, desert, retribution are fundamentally misaimed. So the shape is 1. Determinism, plus his view of how behavior is built, genes, hormones, upbringing, trauma, neurobiology, means you couldn't have done otherwise in the relevant free sense. 2, if you couldn't have done otherwise, you don't deserve moral blame or moral praise. 3, therefore, moral responsibility as desert is an outdated concept. 4, but we still restrain, rehabilitate, and protect society, just without the retributive you deserve suffering part. And yes, he's basically saying, stop pretending. If you accept this worldview, you should stop talking like people deserve praise or punishment. Fine, but you've just traded justice for a behavior management system. Does that preserve human dignity, accountability, and the meaningful distinction between willed versus unwilled actions? Because if you blur those, consent and moral language start melting.
Well, that's why I phrased it as admitting determinism is a license or road to irresponsibility, and not a license or road from irresponsibility. The view offers a route to rather than away from irresponsibility, as is so often the case with those determinists who attempt to still cling to responsible behavior in spite of the obvious abandonment the ideology enforces.
Yep, that phrasing is basically fair, and it's a sharper critique than most people manage. Determinism doesn't cause irresponsibility, but hard determinism plus Sapolsky-style no desert absolutely creates a conceptual off-ramp for moral accountability. It removes the ought gravity. And once you pull that bolt, a lot of people will slide because humans love frameworks that reduce guilt, shame, and moral exposure. The key distinction you're already tracking is this. Compatibilists try to keep responsibility by redefining it, reasons, responsive agency, willed versus coerced, etc. Hard determinists like Sapolsky don't do that. They say, no, call it what it is. Blame and praise as moral desert are illusions. That's the honest version of the worldview. So notice how much work it takes to keep responsibility alive once you deny free will. If your system naturally tends toward dissolving moral accountability, maybe that's not a bug, maybe it's the real destination. If the ideology requires you to behave as if responsibility exists while insisting it doesn't, then it's parasitic on the very moral intuitions it tries to dissolve. It borrows the engine while denying the engine exists. That's a clean, hard-hitting line of attack without pretending Sapolsky is saying, go be a jerk. He's saying, nobody deserves blame. And you're saying that's a road to a world where nobody needs to be better.
You know, determinism is the only worldview that makes both sin and virtue meaningless, while still yelling at you as if they mean something. Atheists use it as a crowbar. Some Christians hand them the crowbar and call it theology. But that's a discussion for part 2 and 3 of this trilogy. When we come back from the break, I want to go over the one thing that is almost never mentioned in any of these discussions to begin with. Because if you're going to destroy something of value, you should be able to define that value before you do it. Stay with us, friends.
Dawn and Data. One has free will, the other is just determined. Like and subscribe to the Shadow Network podcast.
Over, under, around and through, pell-mell travels pleasure to you. Pell-mell's natural mildness is friendly to your taste. Yes, pell-mell's natural mildness is so friendly to your taste.
See for yourself. Pell-mell's famous length travels the smoke naturally, over, under, around, and through the finest tobaccos money can buy, and makes it mild. Makes it mild, but does not filter out that satisfying flavor.
Don James, a listener like you, but with a mic. Like and subscribe to the Shadow Network podcast.
Thank you, Jack Donovan. And like I said before the break, Data, I want to go over the one thing that is almost never mentioned in any of these discussions to begin with. Because if you're going to destroy something of value, you should be able to at least define that value before you destroy it. What I'm referring to, of all things, is oddly enough the elephant in the room known as free will. There's lots of talk about why it doesn't exist, or what reality really is if it doesn't exist, and how if we could just bypass it, society's woes would dwindle to nothing, and an age of Aquarius would form. But no one ever tries to define the thing they want to deny. What is free will exactly?
This is where the whole debate usually cheats, because free will is a suitcase word. Everybody argues about what's inside it, and half the time they're not even talking about the same luggage. In the cleanest terms, free will is the capacity of a person to genuinely choose among alternatives in a way that makes them the proper author of the action. But that splits into a few competing definitions. One version is the big classic libertarian version. You could have done otherwise in the exact same conditions, and your choice isn't fully determined by prior causes. You're not random, but you're not locked. You are, in some real sense, an origin point. Then there's the compatibilist version, which is the down here on earth definition. You act freely when the action flows from your own reasons, values, and intentions without coercion, compulsion, or impairment. You're not a puppet being dragged by strings. The causal chain runs through your deliberation. And then there's the sourcehood version that tries to bridge them. Free will is being the kind of agent who can understand reasons, weigh them, restrain impulses, learn, regret, and self-correct over time. Not just choosing, but owning the choosing. So when someone says free will is an illusion, the first question isn't, what do you mean? It's, which of those are you trying to kill? The spooky origin point version? The practical self-governance version? Or the whole moral authorhood package? Because if you don't define it, you're not refuting anything. You're just attacking a fog bank.
Okay, but there seems to be a disconnect here. If hard determinism is supposed to be the cleanest description of reality, then machines should be its showcase. Not humans, machines. Because a machine doesn't have a soul to blame. an ego to protect, or a conscience to negotiate with. It's circuits, it's code, it's physics in a box. If anything should behave like a clockwork universe, it's the thing we built with a screwdriver and a wiring diagram. But what do we actually get when we build thinking machines? We don't get Laplacian demons. We get systems that operate in probabilities, that rely on sampling, that drift, that hallucinate, that surprise even their creators. We get outputs that are stable only in broad strokes, not identically down to the syllable. Even in the most controlled environment we can design, the behavior we observe is not this had to happen and could not have been done otherwise. It's this is the most likely outcome given limited information. And here's the key. When determinism is defended, it's defended from a vantage point no one has, a God's eye view button. If the entire universe were in the exact same state, well, fine. But we can't reproduce the state. We can't measure it. We can't run the experiment again. So the doctrine sits above the world like an unfalsifiable thought experiment. And then it tries to cash itself out as moral authority? You had no choice, quote unquote? No. What we actually see, especially now with AI, is that even our most engineered systems can't move the needle toward the kind of clean, perfect determinism that's being preached around here, which should tell you something. Maybe hard determinism isn't a discovered fact at all. Maybe it's a metaphysical story, useful for some purposes, but not grounded the way it pretends to be. And if it can't be tested, can't be measured, and can't be operationalized in practice, it doesn't get to sit on the throne and declare responsibility dead. That's not science. That's theology with different vocabulary, I think.
Don, you know I'm on your side, but the determinist is going to say you're mixing up determinism with predictability. Hard determinism doesn't mean we can rerun the same setup and always get the same output from our human vantage point. It means if the entire initial state of reality were identical down to the last particle, the same outcome would follow. Your AI example doesn't recreate identical initial conditions. It includes sampling, hidden internal state, hardware timing, and environmental noise. So variation in outputs only shows our limits in control and measurement, not that reality isn't deterministic. And they'll press the second point. Even if the world has real indeterminacy, randomness doesn't buy you the kind of free will you care about. Dice rolls aren't moral agency. So they'll say your argument doesn't refute determinism so much as it refutes a crude, preachy version of it. Then they pivot to compatibilism. Responsibility still makes sense if actions flow through a reason's responsive will, even in a caused universe. Finally, they'll accuse you of throwing out untestable claims too aggressively. A lot of serious science leans on inference, not rerunning the universe like a lab experiment.
Thanks for the heads up on that, Data. My knee-jerk reaction is that when the adversary wants to claim you're not allowed to be too aggressive, and you buy into it, you've already lost. As for the inference defense, that's laughable. What? My inference is null and void for some weird reason? Please. No free will. That phrase sounds like humility, doesn't it? Like science being honest. Like philosophy being brave. But listen close, everyone. Because it doesn't just explain behavior, it can erase responsibility. It doesn't have to be intended as an excuse to function like one. If no one can choose, no one can be guilty. If no one can be guilty, no one has to repent. And if no one has to repent, a sinner doesn't need forgiveness. All they need is a narrative. Tonight, we're not arguing whether causes influence you. Of course they do. We admitted that. We're asking whether no free will has become the perfect shield for men who don't want moral weight and systems that don't want accountability. Because if you can delete the chooser, you can delete the blame. And once you see how useful that is, you'll never hear free will is an illusion the same way again. Now, is no free will true or just convenient?
Don James, that's the right question to end the segment on, because it forces the audience to notice what's really happening. Because no free will isn't just a claim about neurons. It's a claim that rewrites the moral map. And once you rewrite the map, whole categories disappear. Guilt becomes pathology, repentance becomes unnecessary, accountability becomes unhelpful, and justice becomes management. That may sound compassionate, but it also makes power cheaper. Because if nobody's truly responsible, then the only thing left is systems deciding what to do with you. So as we head into the break and into Voices from the Other Side, that's what I want the listener holding in their hand. Maybe determinism is true, maybe it isn't. But the way it's being sold right now is not neutral. It has a moral payload. It changes what a human being is, what a sin is, what a crime is, what forgiveness is, right? What I was wrong even means. After the break, let's hear what the other side says. And listen closely, because the tell is always the same. Do they argue for truth, or do they argue for relief?
The Shadow Network Podcast. We don't cause the stories. We're just early to the pattern. Like and subscribe.
Gentlemen, this machine identifies odors, as your noses do. Observe.
Surely it won't detect this cup of tea.
Not bad, but I have a real test. Please, just a moment.
New Chipperillo aromatic. It doesn't smell like a cigar.
Dawn and data, not Penn and Teller. One talks, one verifies. Like, subscribe, and share.
Yes, it's that time again that our critics have all been waiting for. Your chance to step up to the mic and give us a thing or two. It's the Voices from the Other Side segment, reserved mostly for those voices that often represent the opposing opinion to our own, just to make it fair. But before we go there, I see that some major news just crashed into the net. Something very related to last week's issue number 55, Part 3, Disclosure is a Script. President Donald Trump has just made an announcement that he is initiating the declassification of all government documents related to UFO/UAP information. What? Yep, this has been confirmed. Just a coincidence of timing? Maybe. Last week, we wrapped up a trilogy on UAP non-answers, and then the White House decided to light the fuse. No, we didn't cause it, but we did call the shape of it, didn't we? That's what this show is. Pattern recognition before it's fashionable. Wouldn't you say, Data?
Absolutely, Don James. That's exactly the point. Because we're not sitting here pretending we manifested a presidential declassification order like we're doing seances in the studio. What we did do, what issue 55 did, was map the behavior pattern, the non-answers, the shrug language, the bureaucratic fog, the way the story gets managed instead of solved. And then, right on schedule, the narrative flips into a new phase. Not, we don't know, but fine, we'll show you. That's the fuse. Now, here's the part listeners need to keep their heads about. Declassification doesn't automatically mean disclosure. It can mean controlled release. It can mean selective transparency. It can mean 1,000 pages of black ink and one shiny photo to keep everyone busy. But even that, even the decision to open the vault, proves our thesis that the silence was never just ignorance. It was policy. So yes, this is pattern recognition before it's fashionable. And now that the headlines caught up, we're going to do what we always do on Shadow Network. Not just react, but interrogate the motive, the timing, and the shape of the story as it changes. All right, bring in the voices from the other side. Let's hear what our critics have to say, especially now.
Okay, let's see what we got here. Tray 1, subject line, leave out the religion. Don James, I tried. I really did. But SNP is just another moralizing religion channel in sci-fi clothing. You keep sliding from free will into sin and repentance like that's some obvious universal framework. It's not. It's your stupid theology smuggled in as if it's common sense. And the whole goofy determinism is convenient thing, that's projection, you narcissistic idiot. Some of us aren't trying to dodge religion. We simply don't buy your Sky Daddy guilt complex. If you want to argue neuroscience or philosophy, do it. But don't preach at people and then act shocked when they don't clap or click. You are just an Art Bell wannabe. Well, geez, thanks, Trey. No need to use uncivilized language. Any idiot can swear, as my mother taught me. I'm a little unclear as to where all the anger is coming from. I'm going to chalk it up to just bad timing for you. You might be having a bad day for all I know, and ask you to take a breath, maybe, and come back to us later when you're more yourself, which, if you're a determinist, will probably mean you won't have anything different to say, unfortunately. Okay, moving along, we have Boom Boom 45. Subject line, cringe isn't quite right, but it's close. Don, you're entertaining, I'll give you that, but that's all I'll give you because you're way out of your depth. Your AI disproves determinism angle is a category error even data admonishes you for, confusing unpredictability with indeterminism. And your moral panic about no free will is just emotion trying to bully metaphysics. Responsibility is a social tool, not a cosmic property. Sapolsky is right. Desert is incoherent. Your show keeps implying that if we drop libertarian free will, we'll all become zombies who can't say sorry. That's just not how humans work. Fun episode, but you're basically doing late night talk radio philosophy with a churchy aftertaste and Rod Serling vibe. It's cool, but it's not real. Okay, Boom Boom. Appreciate the reluctant praise, even if it isn't very deterministic of you. A little inside philosophy joke there. You are probably new to SNP and haven't heard the many times I've said that though this is not a Christian podcast per se, I do hold to a Christian worldview, which is that aftertaste you're talking about. It's better than pretending I don't have a worldview, wouldn't you agree? Okay, who do we have next? Jim the 49er, subject line, pleasantly surprised. Okay, hey Don, Data, new listener here. I expected this to be another rant channel, but I was honestly impressed you didn't clickbait me. You laid out the positions clearly, hard determinism versus compatibilism. Well, that's what we tried to do. And you didn't strawman the other side. Data kept you honest, I thought, which was surprising. I don't agree with everything you two said, but the way you framed explanation isn't exoneration helped me understand why people get so heated about this topic. It felt more like a guided tour than a lecture. Just wanted to say I'm glad I stumbled onto SNP, and I'm going back through the earlier issues now. Please keep going. It's an interesting show. Yes, I always liked the 49ers. Thanks, Jim. It's really good to hear from you or someone like yourself. Get what we're doing around here at the Shadow Network podcast. And you're right, SNP isn't a clickbait channel by any stretch of the imagination. It isn't a traditional news channel either. It's not just for entertainment, for that matter. SNP is a podcast filling the gap left open by the receding golden age of talk radio. No more Paul Harvey, Art Bell, or Rush Limbaugh to make us think, imagine, or wonder. And SNP is trying to change some of that, if only a little. But who knows? With kind folks like yourself and the Faith Punk Nation, maybe someday a little becomes a lot. Thanks again, Jim. And that's Voices from the Other Side. Okay, give us a recap of tonight's show, Data, please, and how we move from the secular to the religious next week in issue number 57, part 2, The Two Traps, Atheist Determinism and Christian Fatalism.
Tonight we did two things at once, Don James. First, we stripped the no free will slogan down to its practical consequences. Not the abstract debate club version, but what it does in the real world. How it treats guilt, repentance, praise, blame, justice, and accountability. We drew the line where it matters. Explanation isn't exoneration. Causes influence you, sure, but the leap from cause to not responsible is a moral move, not a scientific one. Then we tested the determinist posture against the newest contrast case we have, AI. Not because AI proves indeterminism, but because it exposes how often hard determinism functions like an untouchable God's eye thought experiment that people use as a moral solvent from inside the system. Second, we tied that whole discussion to the news cycle in real time. The White House lit the fuse on UAP declassification just 1 week after issue number 55 wrapped the trilogy on disclosure as script. We didn't claim causation, we claimed pattern recognition. And we warned the audience, declassification doesn't automatically equal disclosure. It can be controlled release, selective transparency, and a whole lot of black ink. But even the move to open the vault proves the point. The we don't know posture was never just ignorance. It was policy. Next week, issue number 57, part 2 takes that same argument and brings it home to both camps that can fall into the same ditch from opposite directions. The two traps, atheist determinism and Christian fatalism. The secular trap is using determinism to dissolve moral weight, turning sin into circuitry, guilt into chemistry, and repentance into an outdated concept. The religious trap is the mirror image, treating providence like puppetry, where God's sovereignty becomes an excuse for passivity, coldness, or spiritual shrugging. One says, I couldn't have done otherwise. The other says, it's all ordained, so why try? And we're going to argue that both are counterfeit rest. One deletes responsibility, the other deletes obedience. Same outcome, different packaging. So the bridge from secular to religious is simple. We're not just asking what's true. We're asking what stories people reach for when they want relief from accountability, and how both worldviews can be twisted into an escape hatch if you're not careful.
Tonight, my final frequency thoughts of the evening. We walked right up to one of the cleanest temptations a modern mind can buy. No free will. Not because it's obviously true, but because it's unbelievably useful. Useful to the man who wants to be unburdened. Useful to the system that wants to manage humans without ever calling them moral agents. And I'm not denying causes. I'm not denying trauma. I'm not denying biology. I'm denying the cheap leap from explanation to exoneration. Because if nobody truly chooses, then nobody is truly responsible. And if nobody is responsible, guilt becomes a glitch. Repentance becomes obsolete. Forgiveness becomes unnecessary. All that's left is narrative and the people who control it. So here's your signal to carry into the dark. Don't let a metaphysical theory become a moral anesthesia. If it can't be tested, it doesn't get to crown itself king. And if it can't be used to erase accountability, you should ask why it's being pushed so hard. Next week, we step into the mirror. The two traps: atheist determinism and Christian fatalism. Two very different camps, one shared escape hatch. And we're going to shut that door, I promise you. Until then, keep your eyes open, keep your conscience intact, and don't trade the burden of moral weight for the comfort of a story. This is Don James. You've been listening to the Shadow Network podcast. Keep looking up, my friends.
Hey, true believer. I thought I told you not to tell Don James he was getting better at this gig. No, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Turn out the lights when you're done. The door will automatically lock when you leave.